Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Schuster floated what could be called a new idea, relatively new idea. If you think about our transportation network, it has suffered from having relatively few new ideas. And all of this time that we've had this network, we have, until recently, when we didn't do very much until we were able to pass a long-term bill in 2015, we've been running on the same grid. So I am interested in what the answer to Chairman Schuster's question about exploring new ideas, because it's a very different country that may, where something in the toolbox may work someplace and something not. But Mr. Rogoff, you really made me think about this notion of overmatching or self-help. You would think, particularly with my colleagues on the other side being in charge, you'd want to incentivize that. Out of desperation, of course, we have seen with the gas tax, people just step up without the federal match. But you describe what some would call overmatching, because you've gone back to your taxpayers not only for the gas tax, but for your infrastructure generally. And you are concerned that the administration, which says it wants to reward such states and regions, is in fact cut. You know, in this region, for example, in the District of Columbia, we wanted desperately to have a subway stop, which now the New York Avenue subway stop. Well, because it would help develop an entire area of the District of Columbia, it was funded by business, by the District of Columbia, and by the administration, not any federal transportation funds. It may be the only, it may be one of a kind in the country. But this notion of incentivizing rather than de-incentivizing is of great interest to me, particularly given the dearth of new ideas. Now, I don't want to do anything, and I think on both sides you've heard people say the federal dollars, you begin there. But I wonder if you have given any thought to how to encourage more jurisdictions like the Sound Transit to overmatch or to move ahead on infrastructure while being assured that it wouldn't be punished by the federal government. Now, I'm looking for an incentive because apparently you have done it, perhaps because there was no other way to do it. I'm looking for a positive way to encourage people who want to invest in their own local infrastructure or transit for their own local reasons to, in fact, receive some award, or let's call it encouragement, some incentive from the federal government. Mr. Rogoff, have you given any thought to that? Because it's you who put the thought in my head in the first place.
Well, thank you, Ms. Norton. I have given it some thought, and it's been talked about in the past, and that is, you know, when you talk about these major transit expansions, we should first recognize that unlike the classic 80-20 split of an 80% federal investment to a 20% local investment, by law we are capped at 50%. For the projects that we're seeking assistance for from the FTA right now, we're looking for 40% federal funding to get to Linwood and just 25% funding to get to Federal Way. So these are efforts we're making because we are determined to get there, and the region, the congestion being what it is, needs it very badly.
So, I mean, are you saying, for example, if you wanted to do something new, perhaps take less of a federal match?
Well, we're being backed into that approach, I think, in part by federal budget policy. When I talk about being penalized for overmatching, there was a specific write-up that came out of OMB when the president's budget came forward that called out by name the Puget Sound area, Los Angeles, and Denver, and pointed out as a rationale to eliminate the federal partnership the fact that we had gone to our voters and raised our own taxes for transit expansions.
Now, this is what I mean, Mr. Chairman. You know, if you want to encourage what Puget Sound, what Sound Transit did elsewhere, then we ought to be, and I'm very interested in discussion with you, how can we use that rather than punish that at a time when it's so difficult to get funding? I did want to ask Mr. McKenna a question because he represents the whole state of Missouri, and he spoke about the immediate crisis in rural areas. I couldn't agree more. If we're having trouble in what is a relatively wealthy area in this region, I can't imagine what if we go into Southern Virginia, for example. They must be going through. But you represent an entire state. And while you called attention to the immediate crisis in rural areas, I wonder what you'd say about cities like St. Louis or Kansas City that have pressing needs at the same time. What I'm trying to get to, Mr. McKenna, is what this committee has always avoided, and that is pitting one part of the region against another part, going back to the Eisenhower administration, the recognition that this was one vast network. So I am the first to acknowledge the immediate crisis. I don't see how rural areas are able to do anything. I wonder how you bring together, you who represent the entire state, big cities like St. Louis and Kansas City, with places that can't possibly fund any of their transportation or very few of their transportation needs, like your rural roads.
Well, if the gentlelady would yield just a second, too, I'd like to add to that just the insurance of those, rural areas across the country. How do we ensure that they aren't left out in this process?
Yes.
Well, thank you for the question. In Missouri, what we do is we allocate the limited resources that we have based on objective criteria. It's similar to the allocation that's done by Congress with the Surface Transportation Bill, and that's why we think that's so important. When we look at our rural areas, for instance, we're just now undertaking a replacement of the Champ Clark Bridge, which connects parts of rural Missouri with Illinois. Had we not had that underway, our rural communities would have a 77-mile detour if that bridge went down. It was built originally in 1928. But likewise, we have structures in St. Louis and Kansas City that carry 120,000 cars a day. So it all comes down to dollars and cents and how you allocate those, I think. An objective criteria for allocating resources is critical so that neither area feels that they've been disadvantaged over the other. We use population, we use employment data, we use size of the infrastructure, vehicle miles traveled, and square footage of bridge deck to allocate capital resources among the regions. So the urban areas receive a larger share of the pie, but they should. And the rural areas receive their relative share. What happens is it's very difficult to move the needle on large projects like a major river crossing. This is a $60 million enterprise for us. And we do have to build up resources over years to subsidize that area to be able to make that, because your point is taken that this entire system is connected. And if we let any of those connections go down, we're disconnecting the communities themselves. So it's the allocation of resources objectively, I think, is an antidote to that, but recognizing that there's not enough money coming into the top line to satisfy all the needs in any of the regions is really critical.
Mr. Schuster, and finally, the Chairman Schuster made a very important point. And it perhaps wasn't beneficial to where he represents. And he said that rural areas pay more in gas tax. But then he pointed out what they get back in overfunding. And again, if we lose that notion, that you don't ultimately lose by the funding of a network of transportation and infrastructure, then we've lost the great American transportation lesson. I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Of course, first question may go to Mr. McKenna or Mr. McCartney. We made a lot of progress, I think, in the FAST Act, encouraging intermodal transportation through the National Highway Freight Program and other initiatives. How can we improve on that and in an infrastructure package? You see that freight program work?